Well, today I had a classic Peto interaction. I finally came across the man and I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "Well, I was having a great day until I saw you." And to understand that statement completely, you have to understand that my relatives came over on a prison boat to South Carolina from this part of the world, and I think we keep replaying that for over 20 years every time we see each other, having not quite gotten over it. So I want to join the crowd in saying the best times with Richard Peto when you have a really good argument and you go at it. There's no question about it. But then I want to switch into something I think is very serious, and it's really a ditto to Larry Norton. It's kind of amazing, his talk. I could just sit down, but I'm not going to do that. I'll take my 15 minutes and see if I can convince you that there's a lot at stake right now in adhering to the principle in the face of a radical change that's occurring in the information environment that we're operating in. And the title, many of you will get into this a little bit more. The FDA has had a saying led by Janet Woodcock for a while about certain kinds of trials called SCTs, which actually, the argument about that arose in a meeting where Harold Varmus from NCI, a famous guy, was talking about precision medicine. And Janet Woodcock said, "You know, all those trials you do, they're SCTs." And he thought that was a compliment at first. And then about 5 minutes later, she revealed that meant small, crappy trial. And so what does that really mean? And I come back to the same article. It's quite remarkable. We did not plan this, but we end up with this very influential article that Salim was first author on, and I think was the core part of the lineage that many of us in other parts of the world read and thought about a lot. And I think what's in there is still holding true today. And Larry went through these items. This is my sort of southern interpretation of the first page of that article, which for me has been a guidebook, including my time at the FDA. But this way of thinking is under threat right now for many reasons. And I think there is a way out of it that could be glorious and much more positive, but we'll see what you think. Evidence of the threat came from the revelations now coming from clinicaltrials.gov. I had the privilege of doing a lot of work of getting this around over the years. The vast majority of clinical trials that are done are sort of next to worthless. They couldn't possibly answer a meaningful question. Particularly the academic trials are often so tiny and so inconsequential that they are not even published. It was a shocker to people to see that industry-funded trials were more likely to be published than academically funded trials. And the reason goes back to the basic design. All too often in academia, people do small trials because that's all they can do. The thought of working together to do something larger has been antithetical to the way of life. And the result of that is that despite the wonderful trials and the advances that have been made, for most of the major decisions that we make in a clinic today, we don't know the right answer. We're guessing. And in fact, that number almost precisely in cardiology today is about 80% of the time we don't know what the right thing to do is when we come to a key decision node. And I would put forward that even at its best, the large sample trial, the way it's been done, is too hard to do to get to the point that we really need for the kind of evidence that would really drive clinical practice to a different level. And so I have a nomenclature for clinical trials I've been using, and I plan to write a little bit about this and put them into 4 categories. And I think now the data is getting better and better in clinicaltrials.gov with mandatory results reporting. So you could classify 4 types of trials. Small, crappy trials, I've already described what those are. They're characterized by usually having a nonspecific protocol, no clear hypothesis, inadequate power, and unlikely to ever be published. We do have small, elegant trials, and I bolded some large trials because I do think there is a need for a vibrant set of small, elegant trials that really answer questions to offer up out of the many potential therapies that are proliferating now because of the changes in biology, to have us do the large trials on the best of the breed. Remember that at the FDA, 90% of the drugs that get into phase 1 don't make it onto the market because they have unexpected toxicity or some other problem along the way. Usually, these things can be detected by smaller mechanistic trials, but we need to demand, because these are so labor-intensive and detract from the collaborative behavior that's needed to answer the critical clinical questions, we need to demand a different level of quality for those trials to be done. And then the fourth category is, this is a new one for me, large wasteful trials, and that's almost every industry-funded trial now is doing a whole bunch of stuff that's a total waste of money, with trials costing up to $1 billion per clinical trial being done. And for years, we've been arguing back and forth with Dr. Temple. For a while, I was on the other side of the fence. Is the cause of this the FDA, or is the FDA just a victim of the way the industry deals with the FDA to cause all this to be done? The greatest invention for my career in clinical trials was the fax machine. The idea that you could stick something in a machine and it would come out on the other end was totally revolutionary. Most of the 20-year-olds now, they just can't even relate to what the heck are you talking about with that. The fourth industrial revolution is this new place where we are now, the digital revolution, where the sciences are merging into information disciplines in totality. So you think about 3.2 billion base pairs, what John Dinesh talked about today. It's all being distilled into information. And now we have a situation where all of our cell phones connected to the cloud have more computing power than entire universities had just a couple of years ago. And they're not just means of computing, they're means of transmitting information in a bidirectional manner globally without a digital divide. That is, cell phone numbers are higher in lower income people than higher income people now because of the way our societies have evolved. So how do we take advantage of this going forward? And I think there are two ways that we do it. The first is to really demand that when we do small trials, that they are elegant and that they take into account the complexity of biology that we can now measure. And the second is that we radically change the way we think about clinical practice and randomization and large trials. This is my view of where we've been up until now. It's not a new idea, but in my career of mostly finding negative results in phase 3 and beyond trials, it's almost always been because the developers could only look at one part of the elephant, not the entire elephant, and things were happening in some other pathway that hadn't been anticipated. But now we can fuzzily see the entire elephant, and we can see the herd of elephants and the terrain on which they're operating through geospatial analyses, which happen in real time. We had a great time with the Global Burden of Disease group yesterday at Google with the whole universe of Google entities, imagining what could happen if you put all of the geospatial data together with time-oriented data about not just electronic health records, but all of the social information, which is now readily available in the universe of a place like Google. And so we're now beginning to say the big job ahead of us over the next few years is to do what we've done with roads and cars. 10 years ago, if I had told you, you're going to get into your car and you'll start talking to your car. Now, Richard may have talked to his car 10 years ago, I would guess, and your car will talk back to you, and it will change what it says based on what's happening simultaneously on every road in the country that you're in. You probably would have thought I was crazy. But that's happening as a routine, and it's a strange thought now for people to think about pulling off to the side of the road and taking out a map and looking at it to figure out where to go. The reason that can be done is because every road has been mapped and is kept up to date. And yet for human health, we haven't done that exercise. Rory's British Biobank is the leading cutting edge in that, but it's our intention to make this a commodity just like navigating your car should be. And John gave his own version of this. This is ours. If you look at the total amount of data that can be ingested now, organized and curated, the cost is dropping dramatically by the day. But it's not just the biomolecular data. As I said, it's also the social data. I'm equipped with my study watch, which is measuring 17 things. It's not totally there, but if you combine what can be done with sensors that can be worn and cell phones that we all carry around, cognition, balance, activity, social interaction, it's all there in what's been called the digital phenotype. It's a great article that Tom Insel wrote, who's now CEO of a company working on this topic after having been at the NIMH. But then for the large sample trial, I think we need to go to a new version, which is using health system data. We're all now heavily incentivized for business reasons to collect health data, and we're just getting to the point where the data is beginning to get good enough that it can be used for clinical trials. Our own version of this in the US is called PCORNet. There are many versions of it, but this particular one is built on the idea of why not bring together patients who are concerned about their diseases and their families with organized health systems which have a reason to collect the data, coordinate that activity, and get a wheel churning, which is constantly asking questions, not asking just one question at a time, but always deciding what the next question is in clinical practice and trying to get an answer. And we're not there yet, but we do have data now from both electronic health records and claims data for billing on 122 million Americans, about a third of the country. And if we can just get the doctors interested, which is the big issue now, I think our ability to answer questions is going to increase by several log orders very quickly. Now, this was envisioned at the FDA. What if we went from a system where we did each study one off, one at a time, to a system in which we were constantly collecting the information, constantly interrogating it, asking questions, getting answers, feeding them back into the system, taking advantage of the two-way digital environment that we now live in. And why do I believe this can be done? Because this is the way Google works. And I'm working there half-time. I'm still trying to understand it. It's a little over my head. But a simple way to think about this is in Google's business, if it wants to change something that's integrally related to a computer screen, you're not allowed to change that without doing a randomized trial. Or as they would say it, why would you take a chance on something as important as your business by guessing what the right answer is about what to do? So randomization is built into the Google environment. When you agree to use Google search, you're agreeing to participate in what's called A/B comparisons, which are just big randomized trials done. The dependent variable is not how long you live, it's how much ad revenue accrues over time, or what you're going to click on next, which is a pretty interesting short-term variable. By the way, the real gurus now of marketing and advertising are not just saying what you're going to click on next. It's what are the factors in what you see that will cause you to go from looking at something to clicking on the buy button on the internet to actually buy the item. We need to do this for health, and if we did, I think it would have a big effect. In addition to that, all the analyses don't have to be done in Oxford. We can now do analyses through distributed computing anywhere we want to do them, and I would argue that there's a lot to be gained, particularly as we enter this era of machine learning and other methods, to have a lot of different people looking at the same data and comparing the results that they get. And then finally, in collaboration with Jeremy and Martin, Rory, and others, this is the time to really get involved in the regulatory scheme of how this is going to work. We pretty carefully built in to the 21st century cures legislation in the US and the user fee agreements with the industry to open up the world. Bob mentioned real world data, but the idea here is not just looking at data and trying to figure out what works. The idea is to begin to embed randomized trials within that data But we all need to work together to figure out how to do that. And then I think independently of what country you live in, we all have computing using basically the same tools. We can really accelerate this effort. So in conclusion, what I'd say is there's no technical reason we can't make the clinical trial system more efficient. We've got to get rid of SCTs. We need to use modern digital information about biology and demand that it be used to get reliable answers in the earlier phases so we don't waste our time and money with a 90% failure rate in phase 3. We need to limit the number of large, wasteful trials. There's still a need for some in certain circumstances. And we need to apply the knowledge in practice and iteratively improve practice at a much faster rate than, for example, what's happened in breast cancer that Larry put forward. And this is sort of a plea to get involved right now because the docket is open at the FDA through a whole series of meetings. Not that the FDA is the be-all, end-all, but it certainly has an influence on what happens at the rest of the world. And if we can get that right, I think it'll have a big influence on you all. So I hope that we can take the principles of Richard Peto and apply them at a massively accelerated pace to improve health and healthcare. Thanks.